Kia ora koutou katoa and welcome to this community research webinar. I'm Janet Miller and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to host today's webinar. Now, as you will all know, we've got Garth Nowland-Foreman joining us this morning to present today's material. Garth has many years of experience working with community organisations and NGOs, both in Aotearoa and throughout the Pacific. He's a former lecturer at the Unitec Graduate School of Not-for-Profit Management and an accomplished author and keen researcher. He's passionate about creating a more just and inclusive world. Now, Garth is currently a director at LEAD Centre for Not-for-Profit Governance and Leadership, and his experience working with NGOs and funders has seen him appointed to many boards and advisory panels, both here and in the Pacific. He's also the co-chair here at Community Research, and we're very grateful that he's made time for us here today. And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. Now, just a reminder, throughout this webinar, you're invited to post questions in the chat feed or in our Facebook discussion group. And I'll also let you know that Garth will need us to be slightly gentle with him today as he's just returned from a trip working with communities in the islands and he's got a cough. But he's decided he'd make time to join us here today regardless, and we're really grateful for that. Garth, over to you.
Kia ora. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Janet. So let's get straight into it. Outcome measurement. Outcome measurement has been the flavour of the month for at least the last quarter of a century and probably longer. There is much in what I like to call the mythical or the heroic literature that suggests that all non-profits can and should be able to easily measure their outcomes, if only we are really committed to making a difference, sometimes even implying that it's our own fear of exposure or inadequacies that lead us to sabotage or resist such efforts to measure our outcomes. However, like much mythical literature, this is about as much practical usefulness today as any other heroic tale of ancient Greek or Roman gods. Because sooner or later, if everyone is having problems and difficulties implementing the idea in practice in a useful and affordable way, you have to at some point stop blaming the victims and at least be open to the idea that there may be some systemic problems in how we've conceptualized the whole idea of measuring outcomes. And we need to acknowledge perhaps the need for a system change, not just more training. So as Janet said, my name's Garth Nowland-Foreman, and outcomes have been a bit of an obsession of mine for some time. A few years ago, I pulled together quite a bit of analysis around what was happening in outcomes in the English-speaking world in a paper I prepared originally for a UK voluntary sector research conference and then developed a little bit further. The paper is called Outcomes, Accountability and the Community and Voluntary Sector in New Zealand, Holy Grail, Black Hole, or Wholly Possible. And that's available on the Community Research website, and we'll also provide a link to that if you want to do some more background reading on this. But today, while I will go back to briefly remind us why outcomes are a problem child in the world of measurement and accountability, I mostly want to focus in unpacking what's involved with one particular tool that I've found useful as a workaround to most of the problems that outcomes have. This tool is loosely based around the theory of change concept, and I think it helps us address some of the main limitations of measuring outcomes while still getting some of the key benefits. So, what are outcomes? No one is against outcomes. Most community and voluntary organisations were in fact set up because we want to make a difference, achieve results, achieve outcomes in order to see the change for good. But it's very important, I think, to keep these things called outcomes in perspective. The first and most important step in your personal outcome recovery program is to acknowledge that outcomes do not exist. They are not real. They are made up. They have no physical presence or independent existence in the real world. They are the intellectual equivalent of bumper stickers or simple labels or concepts which different people apply, often in different ways, to try and simplify the complex, ambiguous, and constantly dynamic world of real things in the real world. This was nowhere more clearly demonstrated to my mind than when two government agencies tried to introduce them into Australia 20 odd years ago. Both these government agencies tried to show how simple and straightforward measuring outcomes would be. And unfortunately, they both chose the same example of a counselling service to prove how simple it was. And what one called an outcome, the other agency called an output, and what one called an output, the other called an input, and so on and so on. This just helps to emphasize how arbitrary these labels are and that they don't actually have an independent existence in the real world. They're just concepts that we try and apply to things, like building a little bit of a fence around a little bit of the ocean. You can certainly do it, but it doesn't make that bit of the ocean separate from the rest of the ocean. So where does this metaphor come from? It's essentially the input, throughput, output, outcome model is an extended metaphor from the factory assembly line floor. And if you're involved in doing anything more than simply producing widgets on an assembly line, and especially if you're ever involved with those unpredictable inputs called people, you will soon find the metaphor totally inadequate to deal with all the complexities of the real world. Ironically, there's not a great deal of research to show that to show the outcomes of actually measuring outcomes. Apart from some satisfaction research on enthusiasts and early adopters who are definitely enthusiastic about the idea, at least in the short term, it would be interesting to go back to those same organizations after having a bit of experience of using measures over several years. But that's another piece of research for another day. One little piece of international overview research by Ibrahim observes that results-based monitoring systems like logical framework analysis certainly take a large amount of time, but also have a negative influence on how non-profits think about their work and do not provide non-profit staff with information that they actually use in their day-to-day work. So not very rosy picture from the little that we do know. But let's have a little bit of a quick look at what this input, throughput, output model is before we look at some alternative ways of making sense of what the results we are achieving. While there are a number of slightly different formats, the most common format for an outcomes framework starts with the inputs. So on the assembly line, this was the raw material that you needed to produce your product. Then we move through to the throughputs. This is sometimes called the activities or the processes that you undertake on the assembly line to transform the raw material into the product that you're trying to produce or develop. The third step then is usually described as the outputs. These are the immediate products that fall off the assembly line, whether that's the toaster, the motor car, the light globe, whatever it is that's being produced on the factory floor. The fourth step leads to the illustrates how these outputs lead to the longer term and wider outcomes. There are in fact different outcomes identified for different stakeholders. So the longer term outcome of, say, producing toasters for consumers who buy them may be more consumption of bread, while the longer term outcome for the owners, investors in the toaster factory may be increased profits, market domination measured by market share, etc. Under some of these models, that is the end of the outcome chain, but increasingly there's one further step. Other models add the impact as the final step, and this usually refers to the even wider or longer term effects on society more broadly. For example, population health or obesity, or the reduced carcinogenic effects of burnt bread with better controlled toasting, or whatever else it might be. Just before we leave this brief explanation of the model, did you notice something? The model doesn't actually have any particular space in it for the people we serve: consumers, community members, beneficiaries. They are not mentioned in this metaphor. A strange omission. Well, actually, there is only one logical place they can be put if we follow consistently through on this assembly line metaphor. They can only be conceived as the raw material, the inputs in this framework. Now, that's pretty distasteful to think of the people in the community we serve as the raw material that's played with. So it's often overlooked, tucked away out of sight, or just plain ignored in the outcomes model rather than explicitly described. Now, apart from the internal ambiguity that I've already described, remember, one so-called expert in this field described as an input, what another called as an output, and what someone called an outcome, the other called an output. So apart from that inherent ambiguity, things get even more complicated, and you can start to get perverse effects when you try and start measuring these ephemeral things we call outcomes. First, paying too much attention to measuring outcomes, because it is difficult and demanding in its own right, can distract us. The pig does not get fatter just by measuring it more often. We actually have to do the work as well. That's the main business. This is only, measuring outcomes should only remain a means to an end, not overtake and become an end in itself. Second, the gold standard for measuring something that you could end up using as proof or evidence for anyone, which is often bizarrely demanded of nonprofits, the gold standard for that is randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. Now, RCTs are great for testing pharmaceuticals, and I'm glad there is a rigorous regime that does that. But they don't fit well with the kind of work that most of us nonprofits are involved in. Because, first of all, they require a control group. That means we need to play God and let some people get help while others do not. Secondly, it needs to be truly random which of these you get, which of those get the help and who doesn't, whereas we like to provide help on the basis of need or priority, not randomness. Thirdly, you actually need a really large sample to get reliable results in most cases. So if you were testing some educational program, you'd probably need 300 schools, not just one local school. And you'd need to do this finally over the long term, so you can see how long term the changes stick or do not. And again, we can rarely stay around for the long term. And even if we do wait a year or two after the program has finished, it's a little bit late to help adjust and improve it, or to send in a report to the funder. Perhaps even more seriously, the so-called gold standard in measuring evidence also operates at a snail's pace, as you can only test one particular variable or innovation at a time in the face of millions of design possibilities. For example, if we go back to that schools program, does a particular electronic tablet with a particular software used in a particular way have any effect on classroom learning? But more often than not, the real question is actually, how could tablets be used to maximize learning? So instead, it'd be much more fruitful just to free up a chunk of teachers to experiment and play with different software and different strategies and different ways of using the new tool, rather than have this carefully scientifically controlled testing of evidence. They could then provide a rapid feedback loop, which is the opposite of RCT, and allow those same teachers to continually adjust their strategies to maximize the learning in the classroom and to gradually improve what's going on. Some will stumble onto highly effective strategies, share that with other teachers, bounce new ideas off each other, and the learning and improvement will spiral out. That's how real innovation and improvement actually takes place. On the other hand, RCT is like putting your auditors in charge of innovation. Wrong people for the wrong job. Okay, the practical difficulties with measuring outcomes don't finish here even. The practical difficulties we have are built into the very model of an outcomes framework. As we go up the outcome steps from input to throughput, output, outcomes, and impacts, it systematically gets harder and harder to measure what is going on. What you are trying to measure certainly becomes progressively more ambiguous and to some extent maybe even less knowable. Further up the outcome staircase we go, we face risks and opportunities that become further and further beyond our control. How can we be held accountable for something we have little control over? It doesn't actually make sense. It's like trying to hold the weatherman accountable for the weather. And if we go further up the outcomes steps, the longer and longer we will need to wait in order to check if something is happening or not. Some effect is sticking or not. Some effect is fading or not. For some work that we're involved in, we may be literally talking about waiting generations to know if we're getting the desirable outcomes, let alone impacts we hope for. Now, that's a long time to wait to see if you're on the right track, and it's a long time to wait to send in your report to your funder. And further up the outcome staircase we go, the more external factors like the state of the global economy, family background of the individuals, the distribution of wealth in society, etc., are likely to be behind any changes, positive or negative, and can even crowd out the impact that our particular program may or may not have. We had a classic example of this reported this week when researchers took into account the family background of students. They found that overall there was very little variety in the quality of schools across New Zealand because the big factor was the family background of the students, not whatever the schools did. However, and this is an enormously annoying however, the further along the outcomes chain we go, the more significant it becomes. These upper level effects are what we are most interested in. If this were not the case, we could happily ignore the whole outcomes framework and just monitor busy work at the bottom of the chain. However, we can't be just satisfied monitoring inputs and throughputs unless our interest is limited to how big we are, how efficient we are, or how busy we are. We are, as non-profits, invariably interested in changing things, in what the impact of us is. And that's what means we have to keep coming back to this terrible, difficult field of outcome measurement, despite all its difficulties. And things get even worse when you add money into the equation. You end up ratcheting the damage to yet another level when people start getting paid on results, meaning measurable outcomes, as this leads to all kinds of perverse incentives. Now, I just want to tell you one true story of perverse incentives, that it's okay, it is rated suitable for family viewing, just to illustrate this point. During the time of colonial rule in India, the British government became concerned about the number of cobras on the loose in Delhi. To address this issue, they offered a bounty for every dead cobra the residents delivered. To begin with, this approach worked as planned, with a large number of snakes being killed for the reward. But enterprising locals soon realized they could breed cobras and kill them to claim the reward as well. So then the government realized that they had motivated this perverse behavior they panicked and scrapped the whole bounty program altogether. So, with the snakes now worthless, the breeders simply let them loose in the town to breed wild in the sewers and drains of the city, which made the copra problem in Delhi worse than ever before, even before the bounties were introduced. So we need to be careful what we measure, and even more careful what we pay for. Unfortunately, there are too many real-life stories like this. A classic story from Canada is the Duplessis orphans, where in the post-war period, the federal government paid 70 cents a day for orphans, and who were in orphanages. But if you're in a psychiatric hospital, the sponsor of those hospitals got $2.25 a day per patient. As a result, up to 20,000 orphan children were falsely certified as mentally ill, so one provider could get higher payments. Obviously, this would have had enormous impacts on those children for the rest of their life. Personally, having worked with Australian employment and training schemes for unemployed people, I've seen incredibly well-meaning non-profits fall susceptible to cherry-picking the easy-to-help clients. It became so common they had to invent a term to make it sound more respectable, so people started calling it a selection on capacity to benefit. It basically meant easy people to get a reward for. They would pursue the shortcut of any outcome in a storm, regardless of what clients actually needed. So this led to making life easier for the short-term, poorly paid jobs. And in some cases, the organizations even employed the person themselves because the bounty they got for placing someone in a job was worthwhile. And many, many other ways in which they played the incentives game. In the US, Cathy O'Neill has powerfully described how data can readily become weaponized against the poorest and most marginalized groups in society. In her classic book, Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. So can we do anything in the face of these hopeless conclusions? Having stumbled around this for a while, I think I found something that is a good enough workaround, a real world solution that will enable us to keep our eyes focused on outcomes and impacts, but not get distracted by trying to measure these ephemeral targets. In doing this, I've been inspired by essentially two fundamental ideas. The first is this idea of swimming towards the horizon. In short, what's most important, some might even say crucial, is that we continue to ruthlessly focus our sight on the outcomes we want to achieve. So this is not an argument for ignoring outcomes. We should in fact pay even more attention to them. We should not give up keeping our eye on the outcomes in all that we do, just because of the difficulties of measuring them. But at the same time, it may be useless, or even worse, dangerous, if we put too much store by trying to measure those outcomes. So that's why this analogy of swimming towards the horizon. A colleague of mine used this term to describe what he thought was a feature of non-profits because of our heroic goals that we choose for ourselves. But also, I think it tells us an important thing about how we can treat outcomes. Swimming towards the horizon, it isn't possible to measure how far away we are from the horizon, just in the same way it isn't possible often to measure how much of the outcomes we have achieved. But it does give us a very clear direction. If we keep swimming towards the horizon, if we keep working towards our long-term outcomes, we will surely not end up back on the shore because we know what direction we're going in. So it'll keep us going in the right direction, even if we can't precisely measure how far along the horizon we have moved. And that brings us to the second idea, which I stole from a Nobel Prize winning economist, steal from the best is my motto. John Maynard Keynes, who advises that it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. The temptation is to focus on what's measurable rather than what's most significant. But what Maynard Keynes is saying is we should always focus on what's most significant, even if we only have a rough idea of its size or dimensions. It's much more important to focus on what is much more important. Or as a modern day philosopher, Dilbert would say, I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up, because studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies have shown that? 87. Okay, you can work out how reliable that figure is yourself. This brings us, when we put those two ideas together, swimming towards the horizon and better to be roughly right than precisely wrong, to the tool that I think can help us most, a theory of change. The theory of change essentially is about trying to provide a link between the day-to-day activities that we do, the truly measurable inputs and throughputs, to these long-term ephemeral outcomes or vision or impacts that we are striving to achieve. Now, some people make a distinction between what's called logic models and theories of change. And if you go on to the What Works website in our resources on theories of change, you will find people who make these distinctions very nicely and clearly. I always manage to forget them, so I just mangle them all together, because what's most important here is that we have a logical link between our day-to-day activities and our long-term goal, the horizon, not the format that we put it in. So I don't insist on any particular framework or any particular model, though some people who present logic models or theories of change have their own favorite version. But for me, it can be simple or complex, round or square, triangular or rectangular, multi-directional, one-to-many, many-to-one, or many-to-many. It doesn't matter to me. Whatever makes sense in building a defensible, logical series of links between our day-to-day activities and the our long-term goal or vision. So for me, I simplify it down to just 3 concepts, though you can have as many parts in these concepts as you want. Okay, David, the next slide, thanks. So you can start at any end of my version of the theory of change, but let's say we start at the vision or outcomes end. Here we are trying to identify what's the difference we want to see in the world. What would the world be like, or our bit of it that we serve, when we no longer needed to exist because we'd been fabulously successful? That's our horizon. So don't worry if you don't already have a statement called a vision, or if you do have a statement called a vision. This field is rife with different people calling the same term different things, or different things meaning the same, different terms meaning the same thing. What we're just looking at is your horizon statement. If you've got one already, you can use it, or you can write a new one. So this is the ideal end state, the ideal outcome, the nirvana, when you can happily go out of business. Things like all young people in the Hutt Valley live to their full potential, or a violence-free Central Otago, or all non-profits on the West Coast confident, efficient and effective, or whatever. That's the kind of statement that this will be. And then at the other end, we add in a list of all the regular activities or programs that we think might help contribute to that vision or end. This is the what we do part. These first 2 steps are usually the easiest, because we've thought about it. We're familiar with what we do. We're familiar, usually now these days, with the big picture vision or horizon that we're swimming to. Often the new bit of work, or the new bit of work in making it explicit, is the middle step, the theory of change. And this is why it's likely to be the hardest or to take the most time. So this is our version of the logical links that can sensibly explain how what we do on a day-to-day basis is likely to lead to those big picture changes that we put at the vision at the top of the page. Ideally, there might even be some research to support these ideas. Have a look on community research and you might find some. But in many of the fields that we're working in, there isn't an accepted literature of what's good practice. So the best we can do is at least have a convincing logical argument. And that's the minimum here. Now, it can be just one or two items that make up that logical argument, one or two main steps, simple and linear one-to-one, or it could be as complex as a bowl of spaghetti, those links. That's up to you, whatever works in helping you, first of all, explain it to yourselves, and secondly, you'll probably want to simplify it a little bit more to explain to others, funders, supporters, and other people that you want to convince that what you're doing is likely to be making a difference. Another way of thinking about this is to use a baking analogy. It's like baking a cake. Next slide, David. So at the bottom, what we do, the activities are the ingredients we need to gather. How we get there, the theory of change, is like the method in the recipe. And the finished product, of course, is of the vision and ends is the cake, the difference we want to see in the world. So this is just another way of thinking about this concept of a theory of change, to if that's a metaphor that makes more sense to us. I also quite like the next slide, a bridge metaphor, that the theory of change is the bridge that links the two banks of our vision and activities on either side of the river. Whichever metaphor we're using, one final step before we put our theory of change to work for us is to give it a little bit of what you could call a stress test. We need to make sure that the bridge actually meets in the middle, that the recipe actually makes a cake out of the ingredients. One tool that can help us to do this is the how-why test. So we go from, if we're going from the activities up through the logic chain, we will say, why? Why do these activities lead to these intermediate outcomes? Why do these intermediate outcomes lead to these other intermediate outcomes? And why do these intermediate outcomes lead to these long-term vision or ends? Or working backwards, we use the how question. How do we get to our long-term vision or ends? By achieving these intermediate outcomes. How do we get to these intermediate outcomes? By undertaking these programs and activities. So on the way up, the next step should answer the why do we do this test, and on the way back down, the next step should answer the how do we get there test. What we're doing here is testing the alignment, in effect making sure the bridge actually meets in the middle of the river that it hopes to cross. If it doesn't quite meet, we need to adjust. We might need to adjust our activities and programs. We might need to adjust our vision, long-term goals. We might need to adjust our theory of change, because we need strong alignment, or the basic ideas behind the theory of change won't actually work. It depends on achieving that strong alignment. So how do we use it? This is the big so what question. What do we do with this nice little diagram that we might end up with, apart from sticking it at our wall or maybe in the front of our annual report? Before we do talk about how we use it, I just want to say one very useful side effect that I've found of developing theories of change. It tends to be, for the leadership group, your board and senior staff, an invigorating and enthusing process for almost everyone that I've done this with. As we get back in touch with the why behind our what, we become more committed and share a common understanding that is energizing for all of us. Just focusing on the what can ultimately be pretty boring, but vision, values, and purpose almost always enthuse them. And when we can link that so concretely with our day-to-day activities, it becomes even more powerful. That, however, is not the purpose for doing this. It's just a nice little side effect. The purpose is so that we can monitor and report using some of these intermediate steps, which are much more easy to monitor and report on, and in some cases even count, than trying to measure the ephemeral vision and ends. If our theory of change is indeed robust, then progress along these intermediate steps, if we can report progress along these intermediate steps, it's likely that we're also making progress towards that immeasurable long-term vision or horizon that we're working for. On the screen, you'll see a admittedly simplistic but hypothetical example of a parent education program where one group has tried to draw out the various steps of its own theory of change about how they want to lead to improved child-parent relationships. I'm just going to need to take a sip of water. You'll see once you lay this out in a map that each of these steps readily generate some questions that you might want to keep an eye on at these various steps. So these are the questions in the boxes below the line, the white boxes. Okay, so we're depending on developing a parent education curriculum in the green box and delivering a series of 8 interactive sessions and facilitating some support groups. But what is quality curriculum? How many sessions were held? Would it have been better to hold more sessions? Would that have led to the red boxes better if we'd held more sessions? Or actually, did we already get to the red boxes in half the sessions and we didn't need to hold as many as we did? What were the things that made for the most useful curriculum in achieving those red box intermediate outcomes, like increased knowledge or understanding of child behavior or parenting style? So you'll see that if we think about each of these series of steps in the theory of change, it generates questions that we can use both to monitor and report on what we are achieving, but also even more usefully to help us improve, develop, and learn to do better at each part of the equation, so more efficiently and effectively achieve that long-term outcome that we're seeking, in this case, improved child-parent relations. So hopefully that makes sense, because this is the outcome that we're working towards, and the generating those cunning questions that allow us to measure and monitor and report on the intermediate steps that keep us on track to the long-term goal. So this morning, I just wanted to finish with one further quote, this time from someone who you might recognize, who Einstein once said, "Not everything you can measure counts, and not everything that counts can be measured." We need to always keep in mind that measurement is a bit like a loaded gun. You'll remember from those earlier examples. So we need to make sure we are measuring the most important things, or reporting on the most important things, because people will do more of whatever we pay attention to. And in fact, I've actually got another quote I want to sneak in here from an American colleague, a discussion, an exchange of emails, and he talked about how while measurement of outcomes sounds nice, It's really only the current buzzword in a field attempting to make itself sound like a science when it's really an art. Seasoned social science professionals and volunteers know that the measurement of success will come only in seeing their clients grow to become better citizens, better family members, better human beings. Success is measured by the numbers, very small, who come back 20 or more years later to show you the pictures of their family. Develop the tools for assessment and measurement, but please don't forget that some desired outcomes are to keep bad things from happening 10, 20 or 30 years from now. Don't strip away the delicate infrastructure of society by focusing only on the immediately measurable. Thanks, James Miller, for those words of advice. Thank you.
Kia ora, Garth. Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing your advice, practical advice on how organisations can navigate this challenging world of outcomes and keep on track. Now, just to let everybody know, Garth's already mentioned we do have further resources looking at the theory of change and logic models on our What Works website, and we'll send some of those to you after the webinar as well. Now, given Garth's voice, I think we might retire to the Facebook discussion group to have further kōrero there and questions. If anybody's got any pātai, please do send them in. But one other thing I'd like to mention is if you want to be notified when we're about to broadcast a webinar, like our YouTube channel, and that way, whenever there's a webinar, it'll ping on your phone or on your computer and you'll be straight in there. Now, thank you, Garth, again for your kōrero today. And are you happy to answer questions in the Facebook discussion group there? Yeah, cool. Okay, we'll see everybody there soon.
Welcome to What Works. This website can help you figure out what difference you and your organization are making. Take Tui, for example. Tui is currently under some pressure, swirling in questions, challenging his organization's very existence. Are we making a difference for the people we serve? Could we be more effective? How can we show real results? Tui's organization runs a program designed to help unemployed young people develop work skills. Now Tui's being asked to prove that what they're doing is helping, but he doesn't really know how to go about it. What Works has a series of tools designed to make this easier. You're one step ahead of Tui, given you've been introduced to us already. Our homepage contains some useful information to help you begin. The Consider tab is a good place to get some basic information about what evaluation is and how to do it properly. When it comes to proving that what you're doing is having impact, you need to walk through some basic steps. The Get Started tab contains a number of resources to help you formulate a good evaluation plan, from defining what you need to evaluate to making sure the findings get used. Now that Tui has identified what he needs to know, he can move on to choosing some data gathering and evaluation tools. The Tools tab is divided into two sections. The first is designed to help you choose the right framework or approach. The Methods, Tools, Techniques section contains the different ways of collecting data. Tui's stuck for where to go next and needs help to choose the right tool. To help with that, we have a handy Tools and Approaches matrix, which contains an overview of popular tools and approaches that can be filtered in various ways. Tui thinks he's found a good framework and toolset that matches his organization's evaluation plan, but we'll have a bit of a look through the various case studies under the Stories tab first. It contains a selection of user stories about organizations' experiences using particular tools, so you can see what has worked for them. We're always looking for new stories. If you have an example to share, please contact Community Research. Tui can see organizations similar to his using the approach he picked, so he can see how it's going to work for him. With a good plan and tool set in place, Tui is well on the way to answering those original questions. Most importantly, Tui's organization will build good evidence about their outcomes and learn from the evidence gathered. What works best when organizations like Tui's share their experiences with the wider community so other groups can benefit from the information too. The Share tab contains guidance on becoming a learning organization and ways to share what you learn with others. There are tips on how to present your findings to service users, your board, funders, and the general public. Tui is going to take some more time to explore the website fully. We encourage you to take some time to have a look through the resources and see if they can help you with your work.